Dice. Plural. Noun. Singular. Die. Definition 1. Small cubes of plastic, ivory, bone, or wood marked on each side with 1 to 6 spots, usually used in pairs in games of chance or in gambling. World Wide Hodge Pod. Singular. Noun. Definition 1. A podcast centered around discovering the human story that is wholeheartedly a global story. Hosted by Sasha. Welcome to the show. Hey there, and welcome to this week's Hodge Pod. Alright, to anyone who is listening today, I thank you tremendously, but I also want to say you're welcome for that super slick definition on dice. You're going to need it today because this week's episode is all about dice. Anyways, a further note on the reference, it is from dictionary.com, which works in partnership with Oxford University Press, but that particular definition came from the Random House Unabridged Dictionary, so dictionary.com has a lot of credibility towards contemporary words and words overall, so it's a pretty good definition to take forward with us. Of course, now you might be asking yourself, who am I? What is this? Why should I keep listening? I have answers to at least 2 of those questions. The first one, I am Sasha. I'm just one person, and nowhere do I think that qualifies me to talk about the entire world, but I do think that it creates some relatability. I'm not a journalist. I am not a reporter. I don't have tons of money. I'm just one person. And so I think I can provide a perspective that's easily relatable to when we come to these, well, sometimes overwhelming stories. But it's also why I believe that I need everybody else to help me out. This isn't just my story, it's all of our stories. So we need to jump in and help tell them all. And that's what makes me really excited about this show. As a person of the world who is very curious of what this world has to offer, I want to drag everybody along on this journey and learn together and hopefully become more socially aware through this experience. And that really brings us to what this is. It's an conversation starter. That's what this podcast is. You listen to this, come back to the Twitter or the Instagram, and you meet other people who are just as interested and curious and kind, and start a conversation, learn about the world, things you might have taken for granted, and of course, just enjoy your time. Learning is always fun, and I don't think it should ever stop. And I hope to present things that I learned in a very interesting way. And I kind of touched on this, why you should keep listening. I hope that on a certain level, this is incredibly entertaining. But on a second level, I do believe that this is important because any new ears that this can reach pushes those ears to comprehend new ideas, pushes those ears to think about things they never would have thought, and pushes those ears to just maybe be happier. Maybe that's all it needs to be sometimes. It's just, I hope that this can create more happiness in the world. It makes for a wonderful experience to learn about the world and shape yourself and just be more knowledgeable about things you might have taken for granted. This is a world that we all share, that we all have to take care of. And there are so many cultures we couldn't even begin to comprehend. But that's the whole point of why you should keep listening, is I want to begin to comprehend. So if you want to understand any more, please check out the trailer if you haven't already. Otherwise, check the trailer. It's a quick 1-minute snapshot of everything that this is. Also, there is a 25-minute snapshot of everything that this is. It goes into depth of who I am and what this show really stands for, what it is and what it is. So go to that. It's episode 0. It's called the August Conversation Primer. Anyways, let's begin this show. And I want to start on a simple warm-up exercise and also a fun new segment I want to try, which I think might be cute and fun. I'm going to call it the Easy Icebreaker Bombs. So what these are when you're meeting new people or when you're just talking with anybody or maybe going on a fancy dinner date someday. You can just spout these factoids. I love doing this in my life, and I don't know if it works for anybody else, but I always find that some inconsequential facts to just have in your back pocket just are fun conversation starters. So I'm just going to drop 3 that I found on this week's subject, which is, I guess from the title and everything leading up to it, you figured out, is dice. So first fact, the sides of a dice add up to 7. This means that 1 is opposite to 6, 3 is opposite to 4, and 2 is opposite to 5. kind of a fun fact. This is called the sevens arrangement, and this is just one arrangement of many. The second fact that you should know is cheap dice bought in toy stores and drugstores are referred to as candy dice. So they're just a fun term to describe those cheap dice that you can buy kind of in toy stores or in drugstores. These are generally not very perfect dice. They have rounded corners, they're cheaper to make, and overall don't have a long-lasting longevity, nor are they particularly fair. If you want to understand what makes a fair dice, please keep listening to the main story. And the final thing to know is that the holes you see all around on a dice, well, if you speak American English, they're called spots. And if you speak British English, they're called pips. And so now you know some terminology to use when you're describing the faces of the dice. You can ask, hey, Joe, what's that pip looking like? Or, hey, Rebecca, you got a good spot? Yeah, you can see how easily and very cool you will sound once you implement these factoids in your life. Anyways, those are all jokes aside. I hope that one of those intrigued you enough to kind of just spout as a sort of knowledgeable thing. I like to do this a lot, where I pick up kind of inconsequential facts to bring up. So I thought I'd help somebody out who wanted to start a conversation. Hold on to one of those, and you kind of got your fix of this episode. But as I said, this is a conversation starter. This is a more thorough understanding of the world around us. So if you want to be a truly good citizen of the world, I do say that you should keep listening. And without further ado, let's get right into it.
Prologue. Global Superstars.
Dice used to be global rock stars. Quote, when dice games were particularly popular. Indeed, hundreds of different game rules, including those for dice, have been recorded in historical documents for this period in Western Europe, unquote. Not only that, these dice were universal. Again, quote, in sites in the Low Countries of Northwestern Europe and elsewhere in Eurasia, unquote. These bad boys were everywhere. Everyone was tossing dice, using them, going ham to get some randomly generated numbers. All right. Some of the earliest recorded dice carbon date back to around 3,000 years ago. And then it all came crashing down. Quote, cards became more popular than dice as they were useful not only for gambling, but also for strategy games, unquote. So there you have it, folks. A sexy, alluring story of a rise to fame twice over and watching it all crash and burn to the next new fad. Sorry, I kind of got carried away. Now, the last words are definitely my own embellishments of the subject. I'm just very fascinated that dice used to be everywhere. And all the quotes that you've just heard and facts spouted come from the Journal of Archaeological Science, and it is from a particular article titled The Evolution of Cubic Dice from the Roman through the Post-Medieval Period in the Netherlands, and written by a whole host of authors reporting on the subject. Again, this is kind of how I got introduced to this whole topic of dice. And the reason I bring up my own personal perspective is because you are going to get it. Some things that I've always said in this podcast is that my voice is not the final voice, but it does happen to be the one that you are listening to. So I do make a note of always pointing that out. Anyways, with that being said, dice, global rock stars, used to be everywhere. And I think we need a reunion tour. I think we got to show the entire world what they're made of again. So throughout this episode, I want to plan a game night, essentially. I'm going to need your help to figure it out. We're going to work together to figure out what dice we need, what games we can play, and so forth. So welcome to the episode all about dice.
Chapter 1. Design is everything.
So I think right from the beginning, let's go ahead and do a little bit of an imagination exercise, okay? So close your eyes, whatever you're doing, driving, cutting delicious foods, or if you got your hand stuck in a drain pipe, make sure you close your eyes right now. That's a joke. Now that you are sufficiently focused, essentially is what I should have said, you can now begin to imagine a wonderful, giant game night. It's going to happen in the next few days, and you have to plan it. This is my imagination exercise for you. So you have to plan a game night in the next few nights. We'll say that you are required to invite one person from every country in the world. Or not even country, I don't want to limit it to that. I want everywhere possible in the world, everywhere that people identify from. So you have to invite every one of those people. We'll just say, for the sake of hypotheticals, they have transportation and they know your address. So you don't have to send out one mass text and use up all your data. Don't worry about that. Those people are taken care of. We'll also say you've got your food covered. I mean, that's a huge expense, but I'll say that the World Wide Hodge Pod figured out a way and we pulled through. So food's not a problem. It's probably a huge veggie platter, sadly. But don't worry. Good company can make up for that, I hope. You got that covered. And then you come to the actual game night. We're going to agree that we're doing a dice reunion tour. So let's pick the dice. Let's start easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? So I want you to imagine in your head the first dice or die that comes into your head. However many dice or die that you want, just imagine them in your head. Imagine the shape, the size, the general layout. All right, easy enough, right? We're all thinking of a small dice with a red pip in the center, right? For its 1 and 4, it's red. Or wait, are you thinking of a big red dice with white spots that are equally centered out and leveled out? Or wait, are you thinking of black and white with just, black pips all over? Okay. This is one of the first things we come up in this story. These candy store dice, they're not universal. So you've already encountered your first problem. In certain parts of the world, particularly what I've found to be China, Japan, sometimes India, and Korea, but most of the times China, there are dice that are the standard 6 faces, or die, the standard 6-sided die, and it comes with this giant red pip that's on its one face. A quick reminder, pip are in reference to the spots. So that's already a problem. How do you pick a universal design? This is where, as the runner of the show, I have to step in and point out some faults that I found throughout reading this story. So when I came across this discrepancy in dice design, I came across this idea of Western versus Asian dice. Basically, if you Googled Asian dice, you would find this red pip design. I do, again, find problem with this because I tested it a little bit further in my own research, what this means. And if you search Asian dice in a store like Amazon.com, you do come up with what you are searching for. I have found a lot of wrong in summing it up to Asian. Asia is a region with a lot of different countries and a lot of different perspectives. So while these terms can be helpful, I do want to make a note of I don't think that this is the way you should carry forward the story. And I do want to make a note of this problem that I found and highlighting it as a problem because Asian doesn't always refer to countries that people are from. We've highly associated race with it, and this is scratching the surface of a deeply huge problem that we deal with in the world that deserves its own episode. And I plan on making an episode in the near future on just this subject. Right now, I don't have the time to get into it, but it is more than important to take a moment to pause and understand why this is something of note. To say something is Asian is grouping together a whole variety of people that don't necessarily deserve to be grouped together. So this is why I bring it up. And I urge you heavily to spread the word that Asia spans countries from Turkey to Japan to India to China to several distinct regions in the world. Anyways, you've heard my comment. Carry on the conversation, and please feel free to join it and prove me wrong. Maybe I am overthinking this, but I want to put that out there. I want to take a stance. I want to be able to be argued against. Now, there is, as I mentioned, a difference between the red pip and the black pip. It's nothing major, just a different design. Of course, you can find stories, kind of. It's very difficult to trace an origin of why the 1 pip is painted red alongside the 4 pip. Through the sources that I have come across, there is no touching stone or no collective agreement on what this is. So again, we're already starting here that there is these difference of designs. And I think that is quite interesting because design is kind of everything in the dice. And before we even talk about fairness and mathematical probability, I'm just talking about aesthetics, right? Just the simple look and feel, something that seems so normal to us might be completely foreign to someone else. And I speak of this a little bit through personal experience. I own a red pip die, and I was confused how it got there, and I could not, for the life of me, trace it back when I held it. It wasn't until I started research for this episode that I figured out where I would have picked it up. My life happened to transit through the region where you could have been, and I am a bit hesitant, not because I want to group a whole thing, but I want to keep my privacy to myself. So just a reminder to everybody, we started off this episode asking ourselves, well, what dice design are we going to pick for our universal game night? And I think this is a really good jumping point into another point about design. Dice have not been a universal design like we think it is. Equal squares, equal cubes are not the name of the game. In fact, designs were all over the place, and designs, especially in medieval Roman times, did not matter. This is because dice were believed to be form from which the divine could act through. And it didn't matter what design the dice took because gods would intervene already. So there was no point in keeping them accurate or even fair, or at least our modern idea of what fair means. It's where you get designs such as knucklebone. In fact, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, the precursors of dice were magical devices that primitive people used for the casting of lots to divine the future. The probable immediate forerunners of dice were knucklebones, unquote, which I find really fascinating in that it was just bones tossed to try and get a random assortment, and they were used for a variety of things. But I will link pictures, of course, in the Instagram, but it's hard to describe it. Whatever you're thinking of, small little knucklebones is as good as it gets, and it is the unfair shape. To us, it kind of doesn't register, but to the past, this makes sense. These were already instruments that the divine would interfere with. Of course, the size didn't matter. And that goes to show how for granted we take our image of dice worldwide. This comes from an Atlantic article called Dice Dice Baby and interactiondesign.org, an online library. All these different sources have informed the past few minutes of what you have listened into. But eventually, over time, we get smaller and smaller dice. We get more of what our idea is. And that was really the point of this first bit of imagining what your stereotypical dice looks like, because there isn't quite a stereotypical universal die. And that's okay. This was meant to just highlight how throughout history and time, the globe has taken so many things and molded it to its own creation, to its own specific time and culture. And I hope that has highlighted a bit of this. And this puts us nicely into talking about, well, if any die suits because every die is universal, well then what games can we play?
Chapter 2. Games, 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 and, well, more games.
In one of the first things I recorded for this, or wrote, or kind of was thinking at all, is I haphazardly threw in Yahtzee to the August Conversation Primer episode. I will admit that I know very little about Yahtzee. I just knew that it was popular, and that was maybe a failing, but also a kind of passing joke on my part. But for this episode, I decided I'd play Yahtzee and I'd research, so don't ever say I don't do nothing for this show, okay? Anyways, I played a game of Yahtzee and figured out the rules and found that it was quite fun because I kicked butt. Anyways, I got a Yahtzee. I beat the computer. Sadly, I didn't get to play against anyone real. It's kind of hard to arrange games in this moment. Anyways, I played Yahtzee, and it's just a game with 5 dice, and I should probably get us on the same page. So I won't get into the full rules of Yahtzee, but I will just explain that it is a type of gambling game where you roll dice and try to keep dice and get 4 of a kind, try to get a descending or ascending order. And depending on how good you're rolling, you get to keep score. There's a lot more that I could get in depth to, but just understand it's a semi-gambling, luck-based game. Yahtzee as a brand is a corporate scam. Buy dice, make dice, do whatever you can, just make it cheaper, and you can just get some scratch paper to keep score, and you're good to go. Otherwise, you're in for a good time if you want to play some Yahtzee. Or I don't know what the non-branded name would be, but post-production Sasha to the rescue. Yahtzee, in terms of the spelling Y-A-T-Z-Y, is a public domain dice game. However, the name Y-A-H-T-Z-E-E is a branded game. Otherwise, it's anyone's go at who wants to make Yahtzee. All right, now back to the show. Anyways, there's a lot of games like Yahtzee. There's already one called Liar's Dice has a similar feature to Yahtzee, except that they have a element of bluff, which Yahtzee does not. You roll in the open, and you're kind of taking turns separately to each other. But in Liar's Dice, you roll some, and you might have 3 of a kind, but you can bluff. So, I mean, it's an interesting proposition, is what I found out of all these games. At the core, these are just purely random number generators, trying to apply skill to a game, to a device that is primarily meant to be completely unbiased, completely random, right? Trying to build this game out of them. As the study I said earlier, this is actually something that hurt dice in the long run. There is not a lot of strategy that you can apply to it. I brought up this point of random number generators and luck and gambling at the core because, well, casino games kind of continue on the legacy of dice games in popular fashion. I mean, we have games like Craps and Klondike, which again are very similar type of games where you're simply betting on the likelihood of certain numbers being rolled. Of course, I can give you the rules, but that's not what we're here for. I'll just tell you a little bit about Craps and how it came to be and sort of the worldwide connection to be made with this game, I guess. It has a long medieval origin is what I can start with. Again, I don't like the idea of origins because some histories may tend to prevail over others, and to claim a story starts at a certain point feels disingenuous to the voices lost through time. But the name does come from French crapaud, meaning toad, and it was said to be in reference to how people would sit when they played the original version of Craps. So where this source came from is a French journal describing variations of the game of hazard. So the journal is called La Théorie du jeu de hasard, which is kind of roughly translates to theories of games of hazard, and then it's an analysis of crabs, and it's spelled Krabs. It's a reference to this name and this specific version of the game. And I try to look through patents to craps. There's no written history, really. It's kind of a loose, difficult subject, and the things I'm telling you now are kind of a past collective story of everything going on. So all I can say is that I do like collective stories because you get interesting stories like this from the Wall Street Journal blogs. There was a lady who played craps for nearly 4 hours. So I don't want to spend too much time, but her name was Patricia DeMaro, and she set a craps record in Atlantic City. And she rolled 154 consecutive times in a single turn. It's kind of hard to grasp any of this without actually knowing any of the rules, right? But my favorite thing is at the end of it, she said to somebody at the side that she had never played craps before. So I don't know how true this is. I don't know if she was telling the truth or wanted to get cheeky in the moment. I think it's just an interesting bit of flavor to this whole tale, and kind of goes back to the point that these are primarily games of chance with universal origins from all over. Dice are not unique to any one culture. You can see that in Arabic, Roman, and French cultures, and immigrants and histories all carry different forms of, well, craps, liars, dice, this entire thing. And there's a lot of different games, right, that countries can claim to. And so overall, we're already hitting this point where, okay, the dice design we can't get into, and, well, the games are all over the place. But a fair bet is, I think, if you placed one dice in front of someone and sat them down for a game of chance, whatever you came up with, I think they are themes that connect universally. If I'm super wrong, again, this show is fully open to you hitting me up and telling me that. We're trying to learn together and grow together. But in this pursuit, I started to think, wait, okay, why do I even care if why does it have to be a six-sided dice? Why do I care? And why do six-sided dice reign supreme, right? We all have this collective idea, I think, of the, dice hanging in the dashboard, or this idea of six-sided dice. They're all over in popular culture, or at least I've seen them in my life. So I wanted to ask the question of, why are we bothering with six-sided dice in the first place, right?
Chapter 3. Dice make the world go round.
All right, sorry to disappoint you right from the start, but there is no easy answer. And I think, again, that could also be the subtitled parentheses title of this show. There is no easy answer. But it does lead us into an interesting conversation about polyhedral dice and the mathematics of determining fairness and where we get our ideas of fair. Because have you ever wondered why we classify dice as fair? Feels like an intuitive fact to look at a dice and just know that, yeah, I am equally likely to get any number if I rolled it. But how do you know that? Well, Stanford's Percy Diaconis and Joseph B. Keller, well, they wrote a paper on just this subject, and they touched upon this idea of what counts as fair. And they said, quote, "A convex polyhedron is fair by symmetry if and only if it is a symmetric with respect to all its faces," unquote. It goes on to say, quote, "This means that any face can be transformed into any other face by a rotation, a reflection, or a combined rotation and reflection, which takes the polyhedral into itself," unquote. Lovely definition, lovely words, but it is a really smart way to say that if you were to look at a fair dice, what would be considered a fair dice, then every equal angle would be perfectly indistinguishable from any other. If I took away the faces, you would not be able to tell any side apart from any other. You can move it as many times as you like, and it looks like the first time you picked it up. Well, this truly amounts to the question of how many universally fair dice are there then? How many objects can I pick up and have this symmetry, right? How many times could I move it around and it still looks the same? Well, this is where we start to really get into the question of math and how it helps us determine this, but it also is an interesting look at how math theoretically, when applied to the real world, can sometimes break down, but sometimes it also finds this nice, beautiful place, because what I'm trying to say is that sometimes math is theoretics. Everything working perfectly outputs a perfect answer. But the real world's messy. There's so many factors that we can't account for, so many untold stories that happen that kind of make the math seem wrong. Theoretically, it might be right, but practically, it's wrong. Dice are an interesting place to put this thing into. And I'm going to definitely spend a whole season probably talking about different math concepts or different mathematicians or some sort of thing relating to math, because I think we've all had maybe a bad experience learning it. It's difficult, but I think when you hear the interesting stories surrounded around it, well, then you I think can build an appreciation for it. I know personally I suck at math, but I love taking in math stories and hearing theorems of Tennant's light principle. And that does deserve a Google, okay? But I'll definitely get to it, hopefully, in an episode in a later season. Anyways, one of the things that I did and came across is there was this geekandsundry.com article which broke down this interview with Percy and Diakonis. This YouTuber named Numberphile interviewed Percy Diakonis. Numberphile has upwards of 3 million subscribers and does a ton of math-related videos and interviews with mathematicians currently working in the field. Wonderful YouTube channel, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. I'm not being told to do this. I don't have any reason as to, other than I enjoy the channel and I find that it adds value to my life, so I wanted to share with anyone who's listening. Anyways, there's a lot of lengthy answers that he gives, and I liked this Geek and Sundry article because it started to try and relay the information without seeing it. And Diakonis talks about 5 polyhedrons. So polyhedrons are 3-dimensional objects. And there are only 5 which are actually fair in the sense that each of their faces are of equal size. So according to the definition that I gave you from the journal article, there are only 5 polyhedrons that amount to this definition. So these shapes that are considered fair, which means that their face values are a pure form of this idea of fair, are the cube, which is 6 faces. We kind of know this as the standard 6-sided die. On the other hand, we have the tetrahedron, which is a 3-sided die. This looks like triangles all stuck together in a 3D pattern. Then you have the octahedron, which is 8 sides, and that kind of looks like 2 pyramids stuck to each other. Then there's the others, which are the dodecahedron, and that is a 12-sided dice. And then you have the icosahedron, which is a 20-sided dice. Those are the pure dice. From then on, I want to just take a step back and tell you that I don't take anyone's word from an article without due consideration. I think you heard this a lot earlier, is I like to point out when sources have their faults and they might not be credible, and why I am including the information that I include. I think it is very important in this internet age that we trust the sources that we have and we go about research with responsibility and due diligence. And I hope that this goes without saying, but I will always say it. Any information you get from me, meaning any tweet that I send out with a link, any link that I give, anything I promote, and any sources that I use in the research of this article, I have done my best to vet the hell out of it. And I will let you know if it is less than stellar. All right? I don't want to take any chances. I don't want to promote any wrongful things into the world, but I am just one guy. And what I can promise to you is I always have my full bibliography available with the episode, and that's available on my Twitter. You can follow those links and keep track of the sources I am using, and I go as far as to include things I cite. So I might not always say out loud the thing that I am referencing, but I do contain information from certain sites and certain sources and certain journals. So I don't make it just a works cited. I make a whole bibliography. Anything that might have influenced the things that I am talking about, I want everybody to know. I think openness and honesty is essential in this journey, and I want to put myself out there for people then to tell me if I am wrong, if there is a source that comes up to later have fraudulent information. This is important. And this is so important to me, in fact, that I didn't just take the Geek and Sundry article of that interview. It's about a 21-minute interview with this guy, and I watched the entirety of it. Now, I don't need an award. I don't need anything, right? It was only 21 minutes out of my day for a subject I'm already curious about. But I just had to take a note to let you know that if you find fault in the information, if you feel I don't do a good enough job holding myself accountable, please hold me accountable. Feel free to speak up and start that conversation. Again, these are dangerous times we have where the credibility of a lot of our sources and our news sources are being attacked. All you can do is continue to be diligent, to be smart, and to be thoughtful in the content that you are partaking in, sharing, and listening to. It is my duty, and it is something that I want to push onto people who are listening. With all that said, I watched the entire Numberphile video. Incredibly interesting, and the links are going to be available on the Twitter, and I wholeheartedly recommend you take a look, because listening to the mathematician Diaconis explain this is really interesting, and it's really more interesting to hear it from his perspective and the way he goes about explaining it. So this is how I want to center the discussion of the interview, is this idea between practicality and theoreticals. We can say things wonderfully, but in practice, it's completely different. Let's do practicality first. One of the things he talks about is how dice over time will become round. Long-term frequency is fictional. Basically meaning your dice, the more you use them, well, they wear and tear and become unfair. And then again, we get to this idea of fair. This is a theoretical term that he's going to talk about. And we've already defined what fair is, and we can talk about more fair dice, but already fair is the idea that we're going to have an equally likely chance of having a certain side of the dice come up. Unfair is practicality and how dice are created. As I already said, those candy store dice that I brought up in the beginning, those cheap dice you can buy, well, cheapness comes at a cost. The dice are rounded. The easiest way to explain it is that those rounded corners make for a roll that is far more frequent than thought, so it becomes unfair. Well, then, okay, what if we sanded down those corners and we had equal sides? Well, you already have those pips, right? Those crevices in the sides of your face. Well, if you have 6 on one side, it is a much lighter side than the one side, meaning that more of the dice has been carved out on the top to make room for 6 pips, as opposed to the one side, which only has a single pip, meaning that the 1 will land more often than the 6 because it is heavier. It might be minuscule, but it is practically not fair, right? Theoretically, it makes sense. Practically, it doesn't. And this is something that he goes on to talk a little bit about more. And I've done a little extra research to bump this up. But casino dice are part of this idea. And casinos take a lot of time to make sure that paints are of equal weight and mass, and that they're filled in such a way that no side weighs any more than the other and are considered fair. Casino dice are practicality and theoreticals coming together, and that's kind of an interesting point. Okay, so as long as you have the practicality and the theoreticals coming together, so it's all equally weighted, well then you have to come upon this idea of symmetry, right? Well, that's kind of how you roll back and can create fair dice. It's all about face symmetry. This is a really hard concept to explain without any visual aids. So again, I urge you tremendously to search up Numberphile fair dice. 3 words, Numberphile fair dice. And you can get a really wonderful visual representation of these things and understand this idea of, well, we have an almost infinitely fair dice. So now physics enters the question of fairness. And this kind of belongs to the topic of practicality against theoreticals. So yes, we can make any amount of fair dice, right? But this idea of angular velocity may disqualify a side. Certain shapes, practically speaking, are better than other shapes, which is interesting. Theoretically, they are fair, but in practice, they are not. The way you throw it might affect the way that it can show up on a side more than any other side, and that is why curved dice, so dice that don't have sharp corners, well, those are less fair because angular velocity, the way that you throw the dice, can severely affect how the dice lands. This interesting idea of how you throw the dice is really brought up a lot. And in the interview, it talks about how you have schools that have come up that teach people how to be really good craps players, right? They teach you how to roll a dice, and the strategy there is that you want to throw the dice in such a way that it slides along the bottom, but casinos account for this by having a rubber matting on the back with a very ridged texture, and so that when you hit it, it rolls off of it and causes it to bounce around, show many different sides. So they account for this. But I thought it's just interesting that there are schools that are committed to helping you play chance, to add skill. Anyways, but this is again how practicality outweighs theoreticals, is that even if you can develop the slightest control with dice, say that you figure out how to roll dice that you can minimize the amount of bumps and somehow account for a certain number that you want, you don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to happen every time, nor does it have to be the number you call. As long as you have a slight control, these random games, you develop a huge advantage. So these schools are popular. They make money. Well, all this aside, I think what they brought up in the interview next that becomes a really interesting point for us to talk about is that, think about this. All the dice that you know to be fair that you've rolled in your life one time or another, they're even numbered dice. Odd numbered dice don't exist, and you can try your best to think of an example, and they do that in the interview. So the example he gives, imagine a Toblerone chocolate bar. In case anybody doesn't know what a Toblerone chocolate bar is, it is essentially a tent-shaped chocolate bar. So you have triangular faces on the far ends, and then you have long, essentially rectangular faces connecting those. If you roll it, you can have a pretty good chance that it will roll on one of the rectangular faces. It'll land on the big flat end. But if you keep eating it, shrinking it down till the ends, the triangular ends, are closer and closer to each other, well, you've actually just created a coin, if you think about it. And this brings up a really interesting theoretical and practical matter, is that you can create a fair odd numbered dice in theoretics, but practically you have to adjust each of your designs to the material it is being rolled on. And that's what makes it not fair. Even though you can create one version of a fair dice for a certain surface that is odd numbered, you cannot do that for anything else. And that doesn't make it fair. It is only usable on one surface. And that becomes a bigger question of physics, and they don't really get into it past that. But I found it tremendously interesting that there are no odd-numbered dice. It's just something I hadn't really thought about. So again, those are that idea, that symmetry between fair and not fair, practical and theoretical. And a lot of this information comes from the Hydrological Sciences Journal in their article titled Predictability in Dice Motion, How Does It Differ from Hydrometeorological Processes? Again, I urge you highly to search Numberphile Fair Dice and watch the entire interview for yourself. Very fascinating stuff, and the visuals really help to cement this idea of math and dice and what they can teach us about the world.
Final chapter. And so, the world keeps turning.
All right, well, just a final look at how math and dice and kind of teach us about life. I wanted to highlight Tadashi Tokeda, and I came across him from a Numberphile binge, and he was kind of describing how you can prove the non-transitive probabilistic comparison, essentially meaning that if drug A can beat drug B and drug B can beat drug C, in cases of probability and statistics, there is no transitive property that exists there. A doesn't beat C. And the way he described this in a really interesting interview was how he used the dice to prove this. And the math centered around dice allowed him to create custom dice that, instead of having faces numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he had custom dice that had 2 faces titled 0 and other faces titled 4, or a whole dice that only had the number 3. And so through our collective understanding of mathematics and already known properties of dice, through these different statistical probabilities, he was able to prove that no transitive property exists. Basically, he created a dice called Dice A that had different probabilities of different numbers. And it goes into this really in-depth understanding of what it is. My point of highlighting this is, if you are interested, please go ahead and check out the YouTube video if you want. It's called The Most Powerful Dice by Numberphile. And I brought it up to highlight the fact of how all these things we take for granted in the world have so many universal connections, but also have just so many different applications. Dice, I've only known in board games, but here we are talking about it teaching us about mathematics and non-transitive probabilistic comparison and how you can better approach looking at different drugs, right? Different pharmaceutical drugs, obviously. And it kind of nicely transitions into the final topic I want to touch upon with dice. And that is the idea of the materials that are being used for them and what are good and healthy for the world. Think environmental change and global warming itself are real issues that at any given opportunity we need to be reminded about. Global warming doesn't go away. It continues to ravage our world as we speak. I'm simply pulling up NASA climate change data. Doesn't have to be that complex to start educating yourself about this, but in case you don't want to talk about it or you haven't heard, since 1960, the average temperature of our world has continuously gone up, and it is now a whole degree higher than when we started doing average temperatures. This isn't a fluke. This isn't some kind of conspiracy. This isn't something that will just pass. It's something we have to actively work towards. Kind of is the last touching stone on our story. I sadly cannot turn this podcast into an op-ed on sustainable practices. I don't have the resources or the time really to get in depth, and I hope someone who does hears this and goes on to really touch upon this. This podcast feels important because I hope to at least push the issue out there. And I found that whenever you talk about an issue, people will talk back. So even if there's just the slightest chance that this podcast falls on ears outside of my circle of friends and family, it's worth saying this. It's worth touching on this. It's worth pulling at the strings. And this relates to dice because I have a personal brand that I have always recommended whenever I've shown my friend to RPGs. RPGs are called role-playing games, and if you're curious about those, well, you're going to have a really good episode next week. But the brand I've always recommended is Chessex. I really like them. I think they're really nice dice, and they come at an affordable price. But it was increasingly difficult to discover any of their practices as a regular consumer. As just another person Googling and pulling apart and trying different keywords and going into different industry files. I even looked up one of their business reports or something just to see their revenue stream, right? This is information that's difficult to come by, so I couldn't figure it out. What I did find is a company called EasyRollerDice.com did disclose some of the materials that they use. And one of the common materials that I kept seeing was this material, which was this plastic called thermoset plastic. It's cheaper, but one of the downsides to it, it is non-recyclable, and really, once that plastic has been set, you can't do much else with it. And another simple fact to always remember is that plastics degrade very slowly, if at all. And so through this, made me think, does Chessex do a good job? I already know that over time, dice lose their fairness, their worth, and so at the end of their lifespan, there isn't much to do but throw those away, and they're not recyclable. Recycling can really help the world and really give way to using less waste, to producing less, to easing off of certain things. And I think global warming doesn't just extend to the practices of creating plastics. There is a well-known RPG accessories manufacturer. So we'll make a table that you and your friends can play on, or we'll make special wood handcrafted dice, right? Or out of metal. One of these companies is Wormwood. And it kind of put into starker contrast why I found it appalling that I couldn't easily access information regarding business practice in relation to plastic and dice. Wormwood has a full section dedicated to disclosing their practices. Has the company statement, which says, quote, "At Wormwood, we only source woods that can be legally traded according to CITES, CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora," unquote. Maybe I'm being a bit naive, and I don't understand the full scope of deforesting, which is awful. But this company's taking the extra step to let you know what you're buying, to let you know what they're doing. I think that's a pretty good start. So I wanted to highlight that. I'm not going to be here able to tell any of the answers, but I do want to say it is a problem and that we should be talking about it. And so that brings us to the end of this whole story. There's a lot of dice, a lot of people, a lot of different games to play. And, well, is it even environmentally sustainable to buy all those dice? They're going to be used up anyways, so what's even the point? So, you know what? From the very beginning, they already said that cards were winning over, so maybe they're not that bad. Let's use them. Oh God, I don't want to learn about the best ways to shuffle cards. All right, kick it to the drum. Hey. All right, now that we got all of that whole story under our belts, if you got burning questions, anything you want to say to me, or you're just looking for a good, healthy, safe space, go ahead and follow us on Instagram or Twitter. This isn't just a plug. This is very much a part of what this show is. There is a safe space being created on Twitter and Instagram where we can participate in conversations together, learning from each other and putting our own facts into the world. If there was anything you heard about dice, well then go ahead and tell me what you liked and tell others what you found really interesting. There'll be a pinned question of the week, I think, right after this comes out, and you can join on that thread. Otherwise, go ahead and follow us. The links are at World Hodge Pod. That's World_Hodge_Pod. That way you'll find us on either or. If you don't have a Twitter or an Instagram, I strongly encourage you that you think about it. You don't have to do it, but I urge you to think about joining and following over, joining the community and starting to talk. Otherwise, if that's too much, go ahead over to the Apple Podcast page and leave us a review. It can be good or bad or mediocre. Whatever way you want to join this conversation and let us know what's going on with it is very, very helpful. So don't feel like you're doing nothing by just giving a review or just liking or just following or just listening. Anything that you can do to contribute to this is helpful beyond belief. Otherwise, I don't got much interesting things left to say. This is still a big work in progress, and I'm still figuring out everything that's going on. In fact, I'm still figuring out things so much that I'm going to brag that episode 3 has already been started in production, and it's going to become a thing next week, which will also coincide as the season finale, which I know it's a bit early to get excited about that. This just started, but I got to give myself my own little excitement and my bump. So I'm excited to hit the end of this month having done 3 episodes. So I'll see you there on the final one. Until then, not only am I going to post a thread with a question to talk about and answer back on the Instagram and Twitter, there will be a poll up. So please join in the poll. The poll is going to decide what next month's topic is. If you don't get on there and vote, well, then your vote won't be heard. And it is very valuable to hear your input. So go on there and respond to the polls. Tell me what you want to hear about, what the topic of the month should be. Otherwise, that's all I got left to say. We're going to kick it to the credits and the outro. Again, thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for learning and joining the conversation. This has been a really fun experience already, and I'm excited to keep going. It's very fun to stand here on the edge of the second episode. Otherwise, enjoy your days, enjoy your nights, enjoy your time zone. Catch you guys later on next week's World Wide Hodge Pod. All right, these are the credits. These are going to be incredibly short. Everything is produced by me. Most of the theme music that you hear comes from the YouTube sound library. They're all royalty-free tracks. I can't afford a person to create original music, but I do handpick it. So hopefully the tunes have been fun. Otherwise, all the sound effects you heard today come from zapsplat.com. There's a link to their website at the bottom. They provide really wonderful sound effects that quite add a nice oomph to the things that you're creating. So go ahead, check them out. Otherwise, those are all the credits that are credited. All right, kick it.